Welcome to this final recorded video for the Part A lecture notebook for the fourth module on computational applications. In this video, we will be discussing iterative methods. Now, iterative methods in root finding problems generally refer to those approaches that require an initial guess of the root instead of an initial interval or set that contains the root. This might seem subtle at first, but the distinction is quite profound. These methods generally rely on defining what we call an auxiliary function, which is nothing more than an approximation to the function that is constructed at the current guess in order to form the next best guess at the root of the true function. Now, you might think, aren't all the methods we just saw iterative? Well, yes, they are in a very technical sense because they implement loops. In fact, the false point method somewhat hints at the basic idea of these methods and looks, I should really say the false position method, and looks similar to the secant method. The difference is that bracketing methods, as they were called above, also require a description of a set that contains the root you are looking for, which is significantly more information to specify at the start of a problem than just a single initial guess at the root. Remember what I said. The easier an algorithm is to implement, usually the more restrictive the conditions under which you can implement it. So the bracketing methods require you to know that the root is between two values. The iterative methods do not require that level of knowledge or specification of information to start trying to find the root. The link to the secant method that I provide goes to the Wikipedia article. You will look at this picture, and if you compare it to the picture we were looking at with the false point method, you might say these look really similar. But remember, the false position method was, and I know I will sometimes say false point, and I'm sorry if I've said this before, previously, but it means the same thing. With this method, you require a bracket, an interval that contains the root, this A and this B, and this line is formed by interpolating. That's what the false position method does. That's a bracketing approach. Look at the secant method. Same function, but imagine you start with x1 and x2. Like you just pick a value, you evaluate a guess of what the function is, or excuse me, it'd be like x0 here. And then you have like x1, and you say, okay, well, here's two values, and here's a line, and here's x2. So far, that looks exactly like a0 and b0. So maybe that doesn't look so different. But then look at how the next guess works. x1 and x2 are now the next 2 points, and they form a line through those 2 points and say that's the secant line, and then they approximate. And that looks maybe like it's worse. It can be worse. Sometimes these methods will overperform or underperform the other methods. No one method will always work better than the others. But this is basically just forming what's called a secant line. It uses two values of the function to create a line, and then the root of that line is used to approximate the root of the function. So while it is similar to the false position, it is not required that x naught be negative. The value of the function at x naught is negative while the value at x1 is positive. Now here they're using x naught, x1, and x2 because they're using these as a sequence of guesses or estimates, I should say, for the root. And the formula is going to look very similar to the false position method. So here are the wiki article for this actually contains some code, some Python code. If you scroll down below, you will find it. So here's some generalization. Here you go. Here's some Python code they actually provided in that wiki article. And I copy and edited it slightly here. So can you see where this code can immediately have some difficulty? And what would be a good initial check to ensure that the code does not, let's say, crash? Should a similar check be done at the end of each iteration? So let's look at this secant method. It's rather simple. You have a function f, you have two initial guesses, x0 and x1. They do not require, we don't need to worry about checking whether or not x0 and x1 produce different function values of different signs, and then an n. So with those, we iterate through, and we say here's how we iterate through our guesses, where we're just simply using this formula as is dictated by this algorithm right here. You can do it in either one of these forms, and you can see which one we implemented here. x1 minus this, we used this form. And then it's just basically only just updating x0 and x1 in terms of x1 and x2. That's from the Wikipedia article. Now, I've edited it in a way so that you can store and append your guesses to a list, your estimates, for plotting purposes. So this is for demonstration purposes. So I just changed it a little bit. But let's talk real quickly about where things could go wrong. If x0 and x1 are the same value, that's clearly going to be a problem, because then you will be dividing by 0. So more generally, it's possible to produce x0 and x1 values that produce function values that are the same. By the way, you don't need this float. I'm just going to get rid of that. They must have been dealing with Python code from an earlier version of Python that required that. So I'll just go ahead and remove that here. And so what if I just divide by 0? Now, think back. Here's an example. Here we go. I just scrolled by too fast. You could have produced many function values, perhaps, that had the same, different inputs, but the same output. And then your secant line, would be a horizontal curve parallel to the x-axis. It would never intersect. So there's a good idea, a good thing to consider in terms of editing this, is to make it so that you don't encounter divide by 0 errors. All right. The most difficult thing to understand in the code below is how the end secant lines are plotted. As usual, this is the whole computation that's done. I'm using the secant method for demonstration purposes, and I'm producing all the x's and f values for plotting purposes that I appended into list here. So I initialized lists, and then I'm appending to list at each iteration. That's the only difference between really my code for demonstration purposes and the wiki code. And now when I run this, there's a lot of things going on with plotting, and I have to plot all these. I'm going to plot all the secant lines so you can see what's going on, and that's what's going on here. This is the hardest part of the code to understand, but you can understand it if you recall how slicing of arrays works, and then you can start to figure out what's going on in terms of this. I'm not going to say, because I want you to start thinking about it. You don't necessarily have to understand it, but I do want you to try. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'll be transparent about what the answers are, but I want you to consider for yourself first what's going on before you, and if you can't figure it out, ask me and I'll tell you. So I'll go ahead and run this code, and it's just a lot of plotting. This is all plotting down here. This is the only thing where I'm running that secant method. Again, here's that function. I'm going to go ahead and run it, and you see what's going on. I form this line. Here's x0, here's x1, here's x2. Now look what happens when I go to n equals 2. It took x1, which is the function value there, and x2 produced this function value, and it drew this line, and it produced that new value of x3. Now x3 produces a function value here, x2 produces a function value here, so the next line should go through a point on the curve here and a point on the curve here. Let's see if that happens. It's exactly what happens. You can't quite see the line because it lines up with the blue curve pretty well. But then that produced x4, and now this will produce a function value up here, and the x3 function value here, and there will be a new line that's produced, and that's x5 is that root, and that looks spot on. That looks like a great approximation of the root. So that's pretty much it. Now you can copy and paste. I highly encourage you. Again, you can do, experiment. Take that code and you can create new Lambda functions. So create your favorite function here, or make several of them and play around with it. Or, play around with these different values here. What if, I'll go back to one iteration. What if I had made x1, let's say 1.5? Now remember, the bisection would produce an error. This does not. In fact, it produces a pretty good approximation to the, x1's a decent approximation of the root already, and x2 is not that far off. And now there's x3, they're just kind of hardly moving. x4, they're not really moving too much, and they're annotating on top of each other. And I'm just saying, yeah, the root is already about 0. It's producing that here in the title of the plot. So you can play around with this quite a bit, and I highly encourage it. Different functions, changing the initial 2 guesses of the root, and try to understand and add some commenting to the plots to make sense of all of it. So the activity that I have for you is to improve the secant algorithm. So the same notes as the first two activities in this lecture notebook apply. I want you to create a mySecant function that is improved from what is implemented in the secant method for demo, in the sense that it actually checks for and avoids any of the potential errors, like the division by 0, that may occur before any computation takes place, and also during runtime. Meaning, what I mean by that is before any computation takes place, is you would check, before you even enter into this loop, you would check for a possible division by error here, and then at each iteration, you would check if this is dividing by 0. Now, you can actually do this in one place because you don't do any computations until right here, and so you could put a check here, but it's often good to just check if the initial guesses are bad and just not even bother to iterate. It's just a better way to structure your code, even if it's a little redundant in places. So then I want you to create a myPlot secant that's based on the plot secant function that utilizes mySecant instead of the secant method for demo. And then I want you to test your code on some Lambda functions and using the interact widget on your myPlot secant function. I want you to compare the secant and false position methods. Again, just like the previous activity involving comparison the false position to the bisection, I want you to use a mixture of code and markdown cells. Just read these instructions and follow along. Explain some situations where one could outperform versus another and vice versa, and give examples and try to explain why it's going on. And then, as usual, there is the summary. And please, again, just the usual reminder, write in complete sentences and try to have well-aligned summary points and code examples. That is it. This was a much shorter recording. Thank you for listening, and I'll be talking to you in the Part B lecture notebook of this fourth module on computational applications.